Sorry. All right, so moderating the Q&A session tonight is our Vice President, Kautar Mahmoudi.
Hi everyone, good evening. Before you come up and speak, please identify yourself, name and affiliation. Each person will have up to 2 minutes to make a statement or ask a question. 5 minutes will be allowed for responses from the speaker. When the 30-second sign goes up, please wrap up your statements if you have not already done so. The time up sign will go up when your time is done. All decisions made by the moderator should be respected. Everyone is asked to respect all speakers and not interrupt while everyone is speaking. Thank you. Any questions?
Does this work? Yeah.
My name is Suza. I'm a student from college, and I just wanted to understand, you gave the definition of genocide before, and a lot of people make the distinction between ethnic cleansing not being a war crime and then genocide being one, but then they'll label something ethnic cleansing and not declare it genocide. So I was like, how would you feel about telling people that?
Thank you. That's really a good question, because ethnic cleansing was invented during the Balkan Wars, it's really it's just a phrase. It's like saying I don't know, being mad at someone. It has no weight in international law. War crimes are not always, there are all kinds of war crimes like in Cambodia that are not genocide. I don't think in Yugoslavia there was genocide, and I think that they knew that, so they called it ethnic cleansing in order to put people on trial for war crimes that is very questionable, but I won't go into all that. But I think the term is, in fact, now that Native scholars have taken up the Genocide Convention and doing work at the international level, this is one of the most important applicable pieces of international law for indigenous peoples. Mainstream historians have, in trying to catch up and kind of blunt that force, have insisted that it be called ethnic cleansing, what happened to Native Americans. And there's a new book out by a major historian called Ethnic Cleansing, Not Genocide. In fact, came out last year. So I think it's a ruse, it's an irrelevant term. It's descriptive, it describes something. Another thing they come up with is ethnocide. Well, that's what genocide is ethnocide, but it's a way of not implicating that it's a legal, it's not a moral question, it's a legal question.
Next question.
I'd say with variety, I'm going to ask about immigration. Before we can ask new immigrants to consider what it means to come to a settler colonial situation, we first have to ask ourselves, what are we going to do since we're in that predicament already? Now, the immigrants that are coming here, in many cases, are coming from settler situations themselves. Their whole background is just like ours, settlers, except that they can't make a go of it, so they're coming here. Then we have economic immigrants, people from Europe, people from countries where they're well off. For example, even the poorest of countries, there are well-to-do people who are coming here because they can make much more with their professions, such as medicine, science, math, and so on. So we have to ask them what we haven't asked ourselves. What right do you have to come here so that you can do better? Then we have immigrants that are not immigrants. And these are the people that we have made homeless. We have made orphans. We have made people in a country that can no longer function because we have destroyed the country. These are the people that have a right to come here, and that we have an obligation, if we have any obligation as far as immigrants, to take in here and to relocate and set up. Thank you.
Could you guys clear so people can actually get up and ask questions?
I would just say that I agree with you completely about that, and they really should be considered in most cases refugees and not even immigrants. Yes.
Hello, my name is Kareem. I come to Brooklyn College. I'm a Brooklyn College student. I'm part of the SJP, and I'm sorry if I missed it, but I just wanted to know what is your opinion of a solution for both sides on what's the word for it? The issue, I guess. Thank you.
For Native Americans and for Palestinians, are you saying? For
Wait,
Native
what?
Americans and for Palestinians? Like, what's the solution?
Yeah, what she said.
What do I suggest as a solution? Well, if what I think is a solution implies a lot of, how do we get there is the difficulty. But I think the solution, say in the Native American case, is to, most of the land that was taken through colonization was done in various ways with, some of the treaties were just forced, like when they forcibly relocated the Cherokees, they had this show of a treaty, but what they did was imprison the entire Cherokee government and choose a, random 2 or 3 Cherokees and force them to sign a piece of paper. So that's not an agreement to give up your territory. In other cases, war ended with a peace treaty, like the Lakota Sioux. The Great Sioux Nation covered all of the territory that is now North and South Dakota, Nebraska, and parts of Montana, Wyoming, and Minnesota. And that was eaten away after the 1868 treaty, and then there was allotment that was imposed in the 1880s, so that now there are 9 little separate reservations just in South and North Dakota in that whole territory. Restoring that land, that treaty land, almost all of the land that was taken in that way illegally after treaties is in the hands of is called public lands, and either the federal, some part of the federal government, the Forest Service or the National Park Service or the Bureau of Land Management, military bases, all of this federal and state control property that was taken illegally from Native Americans should be restored to them. And then reparations in huge amounts of money to build their economies. They're the poorest people in the hemisphere, say Pine Ridge in the Sioux Nation. So the solution is also most of the Native nations want independence and not just to be within the United States. So what you see is a very different dismantling of the United States as it is, and that's why I think it's the resolution. As far as Israel goes, clearly going back at least to the 1947 partition, which wasn't fair in itself, but that's the minimal resolution, I think, the only one that in the end would do justice, and for the right to return of all of the people who were dispersed from their homeland, and reparations for rebuilding.
Next question.
David Copeland, Brooklyn for Peace. You mentioned about half of Mexico was taken over with the expansion of settler colonialism. Can you tell us more about the tribe, the indigenous tribes like the Mayans, the Aztecs, and other tribes that were probably in Texas and Arizona and New Mexico. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. Yeah, in the first chapter of my book, I have the chapter is called Follow the Corn. And, the territorial markers in the Western Hemisphere are very, very different from what they are now by these, the administrative units set up by Europeans that invariably every single border cuts people in two. The Mohawk Nation is part in Canada, part in the United States. The Odom people, the Yaquis, are cut by the Mexican border, and all down through, all of Latin America. So the territory, the Andean, this was civilization, the Mesoamerica, the Central America, Valley of Mexico, civilization that built up over, tens of thousands of years. These were also of the 7 centers of agricultural development, which is called civilization, agricultural civilization. 3 of those were in the Americas, in the Andean region, in central Mexico, and the eastern part of North America. And this is where almost all of the cultigens and vegetables and food products, and of course the corn, were created that now feed the world. And so this, these were farmers. 99% of the population of the Americas were farmers. And just like, in other parts of the world at the same time, the populations were very dense. They lived in cities and towns. So, in the attempt to make the land empty, the saying which Israel used, and it's built into the narrative of the United States is, here's a people without land for a land without people. A land without people for people without land. It's the saying that's empty land. And this is such a lie, So Mesoamerica is usually then segregated from anything to do with North America, but all the Muskogee people and the Cherokee people migrated from central Mexico. It was the source of the population of North America. So they're cut off. What colonialism does too is cut people off from each other. And it's what Amilcar Cabral, the Guinea-Bissau liberation leader, called the fissure of history. Colonialism cuts history off. And what we have to do is go back and look at how that history would have developed without the intervention of colonialism, and find those threads to build upon.
How are you? I'm Dr. Shockley, and I happen to be a holistic metapsychologist. And I'm saying something in a way so that you can understand. One of the hardest things I have to do when I'm working with my clients is to get them to, once they're in a place of strength, to go back and look at their family honestly. Because a lot of us are damaged, and then we believe we have myths about who we really are. And that's very dysfunctional, and it makes it impossible for us to function. And I say this to say, as again, it's extremely hard because the blinders are on, and we have a lot invested in believing what we were told about our family, and although most of it's untrue. How do you get people to essentially understand, as Dr. Clark has explained to everyone, you must always look at the history of your oppressor. And when you read Dr. Nell Painter, and she talks about the history of so-called whiteness, and you understand that everything that's being done right now in this continent, in Africa, in Israel, Palestine, whatever the heck you want to call it, is exactly what was done to Europeans by other Europeans. And they had perfected this, clearing the land and saying there's really nobody there, There was nothing. How do you get people to connect the dots to understand that it's not that someone is so-called racist, but they're a brute, and they will exert all the brutality they can upon you under the guise of racism. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really important. I have a whole chapter in the book called The Culture of Conquest, where I'm glad you brought this up, that the institutions of colonialism that were used in the colonization of the Americas were not new. They weren't made up as they went along. In the case of the Iberian Peninsula, what's called Spain, there was this, this 7 centuries of war, really crusades against the Moors in Spain. And 1492 was the great, in 1494 were the great expulsions, final expulsions of even those the Moriscos and the Conversos, the Jews and the Muslims who had converted. They were never trusted, and they were deported on ships. But that occurred over 7 centuries, and then the other crusades, the crusades against the Middle East, all through the Middle East, and against Turkey. These were seasoned fighters. That the loot from these went to the soldiers. It formed the basis of anti-personnel, anti-civilian warfare. But also institutions were built. In the case of England, it was the invasion of first Wales, then Scotland, and then Ireland. And where in Northern Ireland, the Scottish settlers had been displaced by the English landlords coming in and displacing them, were then offered the chance to go get land, from the Irish, and then they lost that. And both groups, the Irish and the Scots-Irish, became the main settlers to the frontier, who never did make it. Most of them stayed poor and landless. So those institutions that were built up were brought over. That was part of the baggage of what was brought and immediately implemented to deadly result, just as it had in Europe. And of course, the closing of the commons in Europe, it wasn't just invading foreign countries, but also using the same people, the same forces, to force the peasants off the land. They were very poor, but they did have some autonomy in that they had the commons where they gathered wood. They were self-sufficient. They gathered wood. They could run their, milk cows. They could have a subsistent living while they still had, to work for the landowner. But the commons were closed and fenced in England and Western Europe. And in England, it was to run sheep for the textile industry. So these were surplus people created. And a part of the settler colonialism for the British was a strategy to get rid of these surplus people, because these surplus people got very rowdy sometimes. They were very angry. They were starving. And they had draconian laws. You could get hung for pickpocketing. And they had too many people, so offering them a one-way boat ride to the colonies where they could kill Indians and take land. This was one way of resolving their class problem in England too.
So I have like a little statement to make first and then a question right after it. A lot of times when talking about racism, there's always that discussion of de facto and de jure racism, so racism that just happens in actuality versus it being there by law. And so going to the state of Israel, a lot of times people will say, oh, so these things happen against the Arabs, but it's not in place in law, but there are actually laws even in the state of Israel, not in the occupied territories that discriminate against Arabs. And one of these laws is the Nakba law, which basically reduces funding to institutions that talk about the Nakba, which is the catastrophe when Palestinians were expelled in 1948. And I just want you to elaborate, then making the connection on any laws that exist for education, education of Native American history in the United States, at what levels it is, elementary school, middle school, high school, higher education, and just, I guess, drawing that connection.
Well, that's really an important point that when I mentioned the doctrine of discovery, this isn't just an arcane doctrine that was put into practice and did historical damage. It's still a live, active U.S. law, Supreme Court decisions, and as you saw with these military cases using those precedents. But in the case of the absolute authority of the sovereign was once a king, and then it's the U.S. federal government over the colonized people, is still in effect. Those Supreme Court decisions in the 1820s that brought the doctrine of discovery into constitutional law in the United States, so that only a few years ago, in 2005, these cases and the doctrine of discovery was cited by none other than Ruth Ginsburg on the Supreme Court. So it's just considered natural, but it is law, and it is built into it is that racism. It's a very good point. And as far as textbooks go in the United States, this is highly politicized. It used to be easy for the society. They simply had white supremacist textbooks and either ignored people of color, Indians, African Americans, and others, or portrayed them in very racist ways. And that's up until the civil rights movement put out challenges. But the textbooks are still, especially with Native Americans, they still don't fit into the grid of any of the narratives that get experimented with, like the nation of immigrants. They're not immigrants. So where are they? Well, then there's this, maybe they came, they used to say 10,000 years ago, now it's like about 100,000 years ago, maybe. Anyway, they're the indigenous peoples. So it doesn't fit, none of the narratives for a unified U.S. Normal, let's say a normal country, a republic of some sort, like maybe Norway, then it doesn't work. Native Americans just throw the monkey wrench in it, their existence. So that's why they're left out mostly, kind of killed off, at least in the newer textbooks, as a great tragedy, seen as a great tragedy, but it was, just diseases went through and somehow they just all fell dead. And it doesn't explain then why the United States was at war all the time against these people who would have just died of disease anyway. Why make all this war against them, hundreds and hundreds of wars and expenditures. The textbooks are very, very alienating, I think, still. And the way they've taken the civil rights advances and made, Obama has a lot of rhetoric about sort of including, as he put it, the people under the lash who suffered to make this country the beautiful country it is now. It's kind of perverted to, frame things in that way, and sort of, it doesn't make slavery benign, but it's this narrative of this constant improvement of the United States based upon a perfect core that had some errors because of, the times and everything. But in fact, they're improved upon all of the time. But we see a society rife with violence, racism, white supremacy, and poverty. So it doesn't seem to be working.
Thank you. Next question.
Hello, my name is Ashley Baziak-Pasoga, and I'm a student here, senior at Brooklyn College, Artisan for Justice in Palestine, and a bunch of other things. And I guess since we're talking about Native Americans here, my mother is a member of the Choctaw Nation. Anyway, my question is about reparations, right? So like, I hear this a lot that, and it's quote unquote controversial, right? But at the same time, I think it's absolutely needed for oppressed peoples to have reparations. However, how could we go about giving these reparations and make sure that it doesn't end up in the wrong hands? Like for instance, with the Native Americans, with like the BIA, who has done terrible things to different nations in this country, or to African American groups, even in father's country, Nigeria. They talked about, the Nigerian government has talked about giving reparations to Biafra. However, it would probably end up in the wrong hands and overseas, and probably the Swiss bank, right? So how would we go about giving these reparations and how?
Well, I think the struggle for reparations for slavery, the reparations of course, for Native people want restitution more than reparations, but I think reparations for rebuilding, rebuilding their basic economies and so that they are not in a dependency situation. How it, I think some of the strategies that have been proposed for, say, reparations for slavery is some kind of, trust fund. But yes, we have a problematic government put, as it is now. So I think it's an educational tool, the reparations. Something I think something can be set up, probably in some context of citizen trusts outside of the formal government that would then be used for building up communities and not kind of per capita payments. This is always a problem when there is there was a Supreme Court case recently that found in favor of a combination of Native people suing who were allottees, and it's billions of dollars that they were cheated out of over a century of time, and they won the case. They actually didn't go to trial. The government settled because the more that was exposed, the more uglier it was, and the more publicity it was getting. So it was all sealed, and they made an agreement for money. So this money's been billed out per capita, and it's never enough money really for investments, or it gets spent. It's fungible. It just goes. So I think something that would be for a basis for economic development. We're so far away from where we were when the reparations demands began, out of the civil rights movement, where there really were structures that this could be implemented, and we've gone so backwards, in any ideas. After all, we know that racism doesn't exist anymore. And so what's the point? Obama was elected, therefore there's no racism. So that's really the mentality, and it's gone so far backward that I think we're going to have to think of new strategies, but I think it shouldn't be dropped as a demand, just as the repatriation of the Palestinians to their homes should never be dropped, because it seems impossible. You don't drop a just demand just because it seems right now impossible, or that the Navajo Nation could be an independent nation. It will be one day, and the Black Hills will be restored, because Native people won't stop fighting until those things happen. Palestinians won't stop fighting. They're not going to go away. And so I think that we have to depend on winning people's hearts and minds, so that there are just massive massive calls and demands and swarms of people forcing these issues, just as that's the only way that anything has ever been advanced, and it has to be kept up, because as we see it just all slides away once that is, and what we're dealing, what's being dealt with now is such an emergency situation of Black Lives Matters and the incarceration. I mean, things have gotten much, much worse than they were at the beginning of civil rights in terms of, things then were just totally controlled, and now it's random, and the police are out of control, and every single African American or person of color is a suspect.
Thank you.
Next question, please.
I'm Michael Minto. Thank you for the talk, first of all. And it's good that you mentioned Black Lives Matter. I actually had a question about that because I wanted to go back to your discussion on genocide, and there was actually a delegation to the United Nations just recently representing the African American community in the United States charging genocide. And we've seen a lot of solidarity between the Black liberation struggle here and the Palestinian struggle, and as victims of apparent genocide. And what I haven't seen as much, at least in these recent struggles, is solidarity with indigenous people and native groups in those fights. And maybe that just is my experience, my limited experience. But it also, rhetorically, I haven't heard so much about it or seen it as a reach out. And I was wondering if you would, if you had any ideas or could shed any light on a basis for reaching out in solidarity with indigenous movements and Black liberation.
Thank you. Yeah, well, the Native Americans, because of the ethnic cleansing, if you want to call it that, east of the Mississippi, there are not large numbers of Native communities. Some have reconstituted themselves because not everyone left. It was just who wouldn't go, who couldn't be forced to go, hid out, or simply they were no longer considered of a Native nation or have any status. They were just an individual. But in this recovery of Native life, and many of these people were mixed, like the Lumbee and the Mashpee and others. So in Supreme Court decisions of whether or not they could be reconstitute themselves as Native people, there were decisions where the court would actually say they don't look like Indians. That's if they were Black. If they were part white, they would get the acknowledgement. So the racism, prevented that. But that's changing, and fortunately. But Native people have, with the American Indian movement, which was very powerful in the 60s and 70s, there's a whole generation of us who came through the American Indian movement, and we took, another generation or two, and it's still, the principles. There was embedded in the American Indian movement was once Native people started going to the United Nations and forming a presence there in 1974. The closest allies that were developed was the Palestine Liberation Organization, which is extremely supportive here in New York. Ambassador Terzi, who grew up in the Palestinian diaspora in Argentina, he was the Palestinian PLO ambassador to the UN. So he had nothing to gain for Palestinians to help out the native people coming to the UN, but they did that. So did the African National Congress and the Southwest African Peoples Organization, Puerto Ricans who were doing work. So this solidarity that was very, very strong, as long as the PLO kind of lasted as a national liberation movement till Oslo. But there's still a very strong affinity, and it's really getting built up again. You could see that at the University of Illinois when Stephen Saleta was hired by the the American Indian Studies Department. That was the job that he got an appointment in there that he then got fired from, because Stephen got his PhD in Native American Studies at the University of Oklahoma. So this affinity is very, very strong, and the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, which is about 10 years old now, I would say probably a third of the participants in it are Palestinian scholars and graduate students. So it is strong, I think that we don't have any real national formations where all of this could come together, these ties, and that's what we have to look at forming, where we have that, where Black, Palestinian, white, Mexican migrants and oppressed people we used to have before Jesse Jackson, the Rainbow Coalition was a coalition of the American Indian Movement, the Puerto Rican independence movement, the Black Panther Party, and the Young Patriots, the white, the poor white Appalachians in Chicago. It came out of Chicago. And it was mainly Fred Hampton, who was the very young leader of the Black Panther Party. And in that also were Palestinians, because there are a lot of Palestinians in the Chicago area. So that existed as very strong unity, and I think a part of what we need to do is recover that history, and see ourselves as a continuation and not just trying to create something new, but actually try to bring those threads and see those relationships and inner solidarity.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Hi, my name is Desmond Ingram. I'm an alumnus at Brooklyn College and a member of the Black Latino Male Initiative. My question is there a distinction between private business and government? That's it.
A distinction? Oh.
So I guess I'm saying, for example, what an American company would do as far as dumping pollution or destroying an economy in a different country. Who do we point the finger at? Who do we hold responsible?
I see. Well, every U.S. corporation is incorporated by a state. The federal government doesn't incorporate corporations, but the states do. And so they're acting as corporate entities, but there's a long history of the United States using public funds and the military to support the intervention of corporations, for economic purposes. The overthrow of whole governments, like the government of Iran that was overthrown, Mossadegh, because he nationalized the oil. So the CIA formed a coup to install the Shah for then decades of torture and misery. Same in Guatemala the year after that. United Fruit Company was nationalized. Their land, only the land they were not using that they had appropriated before the new democratic government came in after World War II. they nationalized that land that wasn't being used by this big company, the United Fruit Company. And the U.S. overthrew that government and installed a military regime, which is, the repercussions are still there. So the United States is complicit in all of these. They're working day and night, I'm sure, right now in the CIA and the State Department to overthrow the Evo Morales in Bolivia and the government of Ecuador, and those who are, trying to put restrictions on the corporations doing what they want to do there. And we have, we don't have enough strong anti-imperialist component to all of our movements anymore, and they're getting by with an awful lot. The special forces are often there, to be brought out to do this kind of work. And, it's not always a direct economic interest. It's sometimes geopolitical positioning as they imagine imperialism. It's not like in Vietnam, there were really no particular resources that it was the geopolitical area where communism was very strong and spreading. And so that war was really for geopolitical, not for economic gains. Otherwise it'd be stupid because there is, oil offshore, but when the United States left and blockaded Vietnam, the Norwegian oil company, the National Oil Company of Norway, went in and got all the contracts for the oil, not U.S. corporations. So it's not always a direct, immediate, it's a whole imperialist control for the purpose of economic control. So I think the U.S. is a capitalist state. It was formed from the beginning as a capitalist state. The capital were the bodies of Africans being bought and sold. That was the major form of capital in the United States, and the land for sale that was taken from the native people. And those are the fundamental roots of U.S. capitalism, which has been the most successful capitalist state in existence ever, built on those, on that foundation. So its behavior in the world is consistent with its, its origins.
Thank you. Does anyone have any other questions? Yes.
On the issue of somebody asked about native activists and non-native activists about there, I see there's a couple of comments, I see two problems with what I've seen, in these other countries. One is that we don't really
Talk in the mic, I can't hear you.
And one of the things I see a lot is that, or don't see actually, is that we don't acknowledge the fact that we live on stolen land. There's never really been a serious discussion about that, not on the East Coast as far as I know. Whereas in Canada, people have been talking about this for about 15 years with the more radical, mostly French activists, working with the Mohawks. But it's part of their analysis, and it's not, I've never really seen that here, except for people saying it in a tokenized way. And the other one is just the assumption that Native people here have look at the problems the same way that other people do who are not native to this country. If you read books from Vine Deloria, and Roxanne would have a lot more authors than I would, in his first book, God is Red, I think, he talks about the 60s and the way that some of the native people were looking at the movements of the 60s and kind of not really being on the same page about what the problems were, what the more important problems were, what the solutions were to those problems. Okay, yeah, that's about it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. It is true that, we've never even, we've gotten close in the United States to overthrowing capitalism. The labor movement in the United States is a template for the world industrial workers of the world, that almost every labor holiday is based on, martyrs of American labor, May Day and 8-hour day and all. It's incredible, and up through the 30s. But this was always, it was also a Jim Crow labor movement, and it's not, African Americans were very active too, the Pullman's Union and all, but there was a segregation of the unions, and this ultimately meant that could be used as a wedge, and of course race has been used as a wedge to create settler solidarity, so that white working class people identify with the aspirations of the wealthy, and even think that they have more than they actually do. In polls, they think they're in the top, like 20% in the income bracket when they're poor. But it's a settler distortion, and it weakens. Without a labor movement, without, masses of people who can stop the economic functioning of a country, it's very, very hard to make really, really solid changes, and this has been the weakness. And of course, in labor movements, but also in many other movements, the women's movement, the discussion of settler colonialism never comes up. It's just taken for granted that manifest destiny is complete and Native people are irrelevant. And it's not just a moral question of recognizing we're on stolen land and it's a settler state, it's that we don't understand the institutions of this country unless we deal with that, because that is what the United States is built on, and it's a monster. It's becoming more a monster every day for its own people, for the people here, and its police forces and the violence, and all over the world. So I think that's why we've never been able to stop it, do anything. And now there's almost a sense of fatalism, like there's nothing that can be done. Maybe overwhelming immigration, a different population will outnumber these people one day, but we can't depend on that. It doesn't mean, people they can always suck out enough people to join the settler class to keep the system going. And it's set up as a very, very undemocratic system, with the Senate, and the structure of government is representative. It's not direct democracy. So we have to find, I think they have to find ways not just to include Native people and the land question and settler colonialism, but make that the basis of the structure of analysis. Start from that and look at everything else. And that's what I try to do in this book, is just tell the whole U.S. history from that point of view. And it's like doing an X-ray where you see all of the bones, and actually more like an MRI where you see the tissue, everything within it, because that's the internal structure. And we'll never be able to change this country unless we deal with that reality. And that leads to, yes, solidarity with Native movements and learning about them and linking up with them. It's extremely important. And supporting their demands for restitution.
Hi, my name is Ibrahim. I'm part of a reading group at the Brooklyn Commons. We spent about 6 weeks.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah, it's me, Mike, and John over there. We spent about 6 weeks with a bigger group of people discussing your book, your work. I'm incredibly happy that a book like yours is out there. There was a lot of learning for a lot of us there, but there's also some unlearning of things that were taught to us about what the history of this country is. So really appreciate your work and everything you continue to do. And beyond, my question was beyond the academic circles where this conversation is taking place, where your book is having an impact and built on the work of a lot of people, how do you suggest that this conversation carries on between families, between individuals in, casual conversations? Because for me, it was a great eye-opening to a lot of the issues, but some of those conversations, how do you take that history and actually live it, right, in conversations, when you meet people, because your world kind of changes. You're listening to Obama give this speech in Selma, for example. I'm there listening, waiting to say something about Native American history, because it's all over. But how do you make that part of the conversation?
Instead, he talks about the great Lewis and Clark, imperialists. That's really important. I was thinking today how if you get in tune, like read Indian Country Today online. That's a very good way to keep up with Native American issues. It's free, and you don't have to sign up for anything or anything else. And it's just keeps you in touch with all of the activities, the Keystone Pipeline struggle, the environmental struggle, the land issues, the UN, the work at the UN, trying to build an international law structure that to present for a future kind of country this could be, to structure new kinds of contexts for social relations and law. But something happened today with an old friend of mine who very excitedly asked me if I had been to the Metropolitan Museum, that there was a fantastic collection of Plains Indians, on the Plains Indians. And I just felt a chill go through me, like, this is such a negative thing. And I said, well, I don't think I could stomach that. She said, well, why not? It's beautiful. They have all these artifacts and everything. It's just gorgeous. And they said, they're all stolen. And they should be given back to, and many of them are sacred items that shouldn't be shown in public even. And, it was something that wouldn't have crossed her mind, that happens every day in museums around the world. These stolen items often from native graves, or that the military took, and then Smithsonian, they're like war trophies, and they're repulsive. So, yeah, there is a Native American museum now run by Native Americans in Washington, D.C., and I don't think they go far enough, in telling the history, and it also includes the whole Western Hemisphere. But they certainly don't, they don't deal in the illicit trade of these sacred items and stolen items. So it's just everyday things like that. You go to a museum, do you notice? Are you repulsed by, or you say, oh, this is so beautiful? It's sort of the stereotypical Plains Indian stuff. And even that, these beautiful paintings that are done of very beautifully costumed Native people, they were all posed, for the photographer. And even that it has a negative effect in that people look at those and they say, oh, that's what an Indian looks like. And then they meet a real Indian who maybe works as a longshoreman or in a mine or in Walmart or as the janitor and dressed in working clothes. And they said, that's not a real Indian then. It has to be a costumed feathers and on display to be a real Indian. So it's another way, another means of, wiping out, making invisible, eliminating the Indian by demanding this so-called authenticity. So I think it's important to, really put your mind to just thinking about things. And this doesn't just apply to, I mean, our consciousness has to be raised every day. We become, because of the African American civil rights movement, things that used to just be taken for granted. A restaurant chain called Little Black Sambo used to be a very popular restaurant chain. Still existed in the 1980s. They finally went out of business. People just stopped going there. But it had a little character, a black character flipping pancakes, and Sambo, of course, was the comical caricature of African American. So, these things do change. The one really good campaign, really important, is to understand what's behind the call for the end of Native mascotry and clowning, and what we are calling red face, for like blackface of that's becoming seemingly more prevalent, but also the sports teams, and especially the Washington team. If you know that term redskin, where it comes from the taking, first of all, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Puritans, they had bounties on Indians. You could bring in a head. First it was a head, and then it was the scalp, and they had done that to the Irish as well in their colonization of Ireland. So it was already a practice they brought with them. But when you cut off the head, or you even strip off the top of the head, and sometimes they would take different parts of the body. The body then there's blood all over it. So basically, redskin is the word they used for a bloody corpse of a dead Indian. It's totally repulsive, and so I think if people understand that, and then understand why are you so attached to that term? Why? Ask the person who defends it, and point out that maybe it's like a war trophy. That your inner settler victory over the Indians, defeating them and taking this land, how much of that is a part of your psyche, and just get people to, reflect on that in themselves. So I think you can challenge, no one ever invites me to Thanksgiving dinner anymore, but we have gotten quite a few. I had a friend who actually bought 15 copies of my book to hand out at the Thanksgiving dinner of her extended family. I'm sure she will not be invited back next year either. Well, thank you all very much for coming. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you everyone for coming to our event. Thanks to our amazing speaker for giving a brilliant lecture.